Hi, my name is Evan Brenner, and I'm the Digital Content Specialist at Geographic Solutions. Thank you for joining us today. We're excited to present a panel discussion on trends in employment for persons with disabilities. Since December 2020, the Pathways to Employment series has showcased how our clients and partners perform outstanding work on a daily basis. It is also a way to discuss pertinent topics that relate to the industries that we support. We've covered a wide variety of topics, including trends in apprenticeships, upskilling, career planning, and more. Today, we hope that you'll learn something new, take away a best practice, or answer a burning question. So, a little bit about us. Geographic Solutions has been in business for more than 30 years. We employ over 425 full-time employees focused on developing solutions for workforce development, labor market, and unemployment insurance solutions. Now, a little bit of housekeeping before we get into our session today. To enable captions, please select the captions/subtitles in your video controls. There is a brief delay between the production and the broadcast. So we encourage you to ask questions, and we will acknowledge all questions throughout the presentation. But we will address all questions at the end of the presentation during the Q&A period towards the end of the discussion. So without further ado, I would now like to go ahead and introduce our panelists. Folks, please help me welcome Andy Imperato, Executive Director of Disability Rights California, Joe Devon, CEO of Diamond and co-founder of Global Accessibility Awareness Day, and our very own Joe Rowan, QA Accessibility Tester at Geographic Solutions. Starting with Andy, I'd like you to briefly introduce yourself. Andy?
Thank you, Evan. My name's Andy Imperato, and I'm the Executive Director at Disability Rights California, based in Sacramento. We are a legal services organization that provides free legal services to people with disabilities across the state of California, and I have lived experience with bipolar disorder. Great to be here with you today.
Andy, thank you so much. And to Joe Devon.
Thank you, Evan. I'm Joe Devon, co-founder and CEO of Diamond, and we are an inclusive digital agency that builds digital experiences accessibly by default, which is pretty unique. I'm also co-founder of Global Accessibility Awareness Day, which is GAD for short, and chair of the GAD Foundation. And just for a quick backgrounder, Global Accessibility Awareness Day started 11 years ago and has grown virally from the first year to the point now that on Twitter, we have a Twitter reach of over 200 million users that are exposed to the GAD hashtag on the day.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Andy, and thank you for being here. And now over to Joe Rowan. Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thanks, Evan. Good morning, everyone. My name is Joe Rowan. I work here at Geographic Solutions as a quality assurance accessibility tester. My specialty is screen reader. I'm a person who's blind. I've been using assistive technology for over 30 years in a variety of areas, from computers to my phone to almost everything in my house talks. I have a good technical background, and I'm happy to help Geographic Solutions make their products accessible.
Joe, thank you. Thank you so much for being with us. And thank you to all for being with us today. Andy, I'd like to get into our discussion at this point. So I'd like to start off by asking you to just describe 3 trends that you're seeing in employment and, just describe their impact on disability rights.
Sure. So, I think one of the things that we've all experienced during the pandemic is a real disruption to how we work. And, when I started at Disability Rights California as the executive director, it was February of 2020. So I started a month before the pandemic. And I remember having a conversation with my human resources director about our workplace flexibility policies, because as you can imagine, we had a lot of employees who were interested in working from home. And we had a policy where it was a lot easier for our attorneys to work from home than it was for the rest of our employees. And I think one of the things we and lots of employers discovered during the pandemic is there are lots of jobs that can be done well from home. So I think the combination of what we learned about workplace flexibility and remote work and the Great Resignation and the fact that, you know, a lot of employers are experiencing labor market shortages, I feel like employees have more power to negotiate terms around workplace flexibility, where they work, their hours, if it's a hybrid, kind of the terms of the hybrid work relationship where they may be in an office some of the time and at home some of the time. And I feel like we're still kind of learning the norms around that. I think for people with disabilities and for disability rights, you know, one of the questions in an Americans with Disabilities Act analysis is, what is a reasonable accommodation? And I think there's a history of courts and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and others saying working from home permanently may not be reasonable under lots of circumstances. I think the reasonableness of that post-pandemic is it's going to be more frequent, that it's viewed as a reasonable accommodation. So to me, that's a positive. I think one of the potential negatives that we don't talk about a lot is I'm worried that some people with disabilities are going to get pigeonholed as ideal candidates for permanent work from home, which can interfere with their ability to interact, you know, informally with colleagues like you do in an office setting, and it may hold them back from a career standpoint. So I think whatever happens moving forward, I'm hoping people with disabilities have the same access to the office as employees without disabilities, to the extent that we are going to continue to use offices in some form. Just a couple other trends quickly. One thing that I'm experiencing is we have kind of a national conversation that's certainly playing out in California about equity, and what do we mean by diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. And what I'm hearing from my employees in California, and I think lots of employers are experiencing, is employees want to have some kind of metrics around equity, not just what are your diversity statistics, but how do your employees in different categories of diversity feel about their work environment? What are they experiencing in the work environment? Do they feel like they have equal access to career advancement? So those are all issues that we're diving into. We've done surveys of our employees, we're diving into the data, and we have a strategic goal as an organization to champion and model diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think for us moving forward, a lot of that's going to be driven by metrics. What are we hearing directly from our employees? And then how can we respond to try to move those net metrics in a positive direction over time? And then last, you know, in California and lots of states, we're moving away from segregated sub-minimum wage employment to competitive integrated employment for people with more significant disabilities. And I would say that's part of a broader trend to try to modernize our thinking and how we support people with the most significant disabilities so that they can have success in the competitive labor market, and we don't have to continue to have these anachronistic models like we have under Section 14C of the Fair Labor Standards Act, where it's still okay today at the federal level to pay somebody with a disability less than minimum wage if their productivity is reduced because of their disability. We think that that's old thinking. We're glad that California has moved away from that, and lots of other states have, but I think that's a trend that the whole country is going to be moving away from segregation and moving away from sub-minimum wage employment.
Andy, thank you. And I like the part about the interactions and whether that might hold, you know, somebody back. And I think that's one thing with the return to the office that, you know, I was excited about. I'm like, oh, I'm like a real people person, so I love, you know, seeing people, and so that's always one thing I think in the back of my mind as well. So, you know, skipping ahead, we kind of talked about remote and flexible work and how it is affecting employment for persons with disabilities. And so I kind of want to skip on to the next question. And based on your insight, how can folks in the workforce industry better assist persons with disabilities to meet their ultimate goal of successful career pathways?
Yeah, so, you know, Evan, I do a lot of kind of informal coaching and mentoring of folks with disabilities and thinking about their careers. Part of it is based on what's worked for me as a lawyer with bipolar disorder who's been open about my disability throughout my career. And one of the things I encourage folks to think about is look at the tasks that they have in a job, especially early in their careers, and pay attention to which tasks give them energy and which tasks suck the energy out of them. And if you can shape your career over time so that you spend more time on the things that energize you and that make you excited, and spend less time on things that just don't provide any fulfillment or excitement for you, then you're more likely to have success in your career. It's kind of like when you're in college, people say, choose your courses based on the quality of the professor, not based on the topic, because a good professor can make any topic interesting. But I think our job as we figure out a career is to try to put ourselves in environments and doing tasks that we find interesting and that we look forward to and we get energized by, and that's going to be different for every person. I also think once you know kind of the area, like for me, it was policy. I love doing policy work. Once you know the area that really lights your fire, try to connect yourself with people who have mastery in that area, and don't limit yourself to the people in your immediate work environment. My first job doing disability work, I was at a protection and advocacy agency similar to Disability Rights California, but I was in Boston at the Disability Law Center, and I was working on advocacy for children on the SSI program. And I found that the people who really had mastery in that were in other organizations. Some of them were in Washington, D.C., some of them were in coalition partners in Massachusetts. And I ended up spending a lot of time with them to try to learn what I could about the topic that I was working in. So again, pay attention to what energizes you, try to connect with people who have mastery in that area. And then the last thing I would lift up is your work environment itself. And this matters a lot for me as somebody who experiences depression and hypomania on a pretty regular basis. I don't do well in quiet, conservative, staid work environments. I do better in work environments that are informal, open, lots of laughing. People, are encouraged to be creative, to be idiosyncratic, to think outside the box. So not surprisingly, in my 26 years in Washington, I didn't do great working in large bureaucracies, and I don't think I would do great working in any large entity that doesn't encourage kind of creativity and entrepreneurial approaches to the work. So for me, my sweet spot was working in the nonprofit space and also working on the Hill, where when you work for a member of Congress, there's not that many layers between you and the member. And I just found that work environment for policy to be a lot more interesting and exciting than working in the executive branch. So I just think as you think about your career, again, pay attention to what are the work environments where you can thrive, and try to be conscious about, driving a career path where you're landing in environments where you can be your best self.
Excellent. Thank you, Andy. And Andy, describe a few of your favorite resources for assisting persons with disabilities on their career pathways to finding employment.
Well, I think one great resource that's been around for decades that's funded by the federal government is called the Job Accommodations Network. And this is a great resource both for employers and employees. If you have a particular job and you're trying to figure out an accommodation that can help you do that job better, this is a free federal resource, federally funded resource that you can go to and ask about technology related accommodations, ask about non-technology related accommodations. You can describe the job, describe whatever kind of your barriers might be in that job, and be connected with a specialist who can help you think about accommodations in the context of that job. So I think it's a resource that's probably underutilized on the employee side. It tends to get utilized more by employers, but from the beginning, it was intended to be a resource for both, and it's confidential, so people are comfortable going there and not worrying that somehow it's going to create any ADA liability for them. I just think it's a good free resource that has built up a lot of expertise over time, funded by the federal government. If you just Google Job Accommodations Network, you can find the resource. They have a website, 800 number, multiple ways to get in touch with them. Two other resources that are newer that I am kind of inspired by. One is called the Valuable 500, which is a global effort to bring together CEOs to have a conversation about disability inclusion at the CEO level and drive change from that level. And I feel like, when I was working for Senator Harkin, his top priority at the end of his career in the Senate was getting more people with disabilities into the labor force. And I think one of the insights that we both had was we don't engage employers directly enough at the top level of the company about the business value of disability inclusion. And I think that's really what the Valuable 500 is trying to do. There's a reason they picked the name Valuable to be their name. The point that they're trying to make is that there's a lot of money that can be made and there's a lot of business success that can be had if you figure out disability inclusion. And as a CEO, you need to make it your business to understand this issue. And you can't just leave it to your diversity leadership or your HR leadership or some other part of the company. The leadership has to come from the CEO level. So they have a big social media presence. Again, if you just Google Valuable 500, you can find them. But I think they're putting out a lot of great content. They've engaged with the World Economic Forum and a number of global entities, the UN, other entities. And I'm just excited to see kind of the learning and what is going to grow out of this collaboration. And then finally, my former association, the American Association of People with Disabilities, where I was the CEO for 11 years, they've partnered with a company or a nonprofit called Disability In, which is kind of a US version of the Valuable 500 that's trying to bring together US businesses to work together around disability inclusion. And AAPD and Disability In are working together on something called the Disability Equality Index, which is a way to measure companies' performance around inclusion of people with disabilities. And again, both AAPD and Disability In have a big online presence, a lot of social media, share a lot of good information. So I think they're both good resources to follow as people are trying to stay abreast of what's happening and potentially learn about job opportunities and career opportunities.
Thank you, Andy, and I appreciate you sharing those resources. And I just wanted to throw this out to the audience. If you have a resource that you want to share, please, by all means, put it in the Q&A tab. You can find that by going to the top of your Microsoft Teams and adding a question. That's also how we'll have our discussion later today, so please add some questions. And finally, Andy, one more question before we move on. What are the 3 most important things that we can do as a society to create a more disability-friendly workforce?
Well, I think it starts with us, those of us with disabilities ourselves. I think if we're going to have a disability-friendly workforce, the people with disabilities in the workforce need to be out and open with our disabilities at work. You know, a lot of people that have disabilities that are protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act are people like me whose disabilities are not visible. So if we're not out and open with our disabilities at work, we miss the opportunity to create a culture change and to create an inclusive work environment for other folks with disabilities. And it's not like some people think the only reason to disclose your disability is if you need an accommodation. And I just don't agree with that. I think there are lots of other good reasons to disclose your disability. I think one of our opportunities as disabled people is to leverage our lived experience as a positive differentiator in the workplace. So it's not just about what do we need to be successful at work, it's about what have we learned from our disability experience that can help our company do better in reaching the disability community as a market for talent and in reaching the disability community as a market for goods and services. So kind of disability pride to me is something that employers should care about and want to cultivate and really encourage people to be out and open and bring their whole selves to work, not just around their disability identities, but around all of their identities. The second thing is just promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion and workplace flexibility as good core values that are kind of essential in order to be successful in the modern economy, and making sure that disability is part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation, and that when we're talking about disability, we're looking at all of the diversity that exists within that category. People with disabilities show up in every other category. The disability category itself is incredibly diverse. So I think DEI is a good frame because it leads to intersectional thinking, not just about disability, but about all the identities that people bring to the workplace. And then finally, using data to promote equity. I think we're at a point, you know, as a country where we can't just use rhetoric, but we actually have to measure how we're doing and then create a baseline and try to do better over time. So the data can be around how accessible is our technology. The data can be how do our employees feel about their work environment. You can do salary equity analysis with data. But if you're not using data to promote equity, then I think your commitment to equity is not going to be as effective in terms of making real progress over time.
Andy, thank you. And I appreciate you taking the time to share this insight with us. And we will discuss more when we get to our live Q&A. We'll see if there's some questions and we'll go that route. So I would like to say again, please go ahead and add a question, add 2 questions. Let's go ahead and get a good amount of questions together so we can have a nice discussion at the end of our presentation. Now I'd like to go and move over to Joe Devon. So Joe, again, thank you for being here today. And Joe, I wanted to lead this off by asking you, what are 3 major shifts that you've seen from the beginning of the pandemic until now on employment with regards to accessibility?
Yeah, great question. And just think about this. You had employers that had years and years and years, decades, to try and figure out for their people with disabilities all kinds of ways to set up accommodations and whatever might be necessary to have their employees work well in the workplace. And then overnight, you have this pandemic that causes everybody to stay at home, and suddenly virtual conferencing becomes the center of almost everybody's universe. And one of the things that maybe folks don't think about is the fact that it's something that's become ubiquitous because everybody has had to learn it, and therefore overnight it's all over Microsoft Teams, Zoom, and all the other platforms. And so in terms of the shift, because that happened, what was super interesting is that every one of the virtual conference platforms within a matter of 2 to 3 months started to release accessibility features. And this would be from automated captions to being able to move your captions around to just generally making sure that the applications are accessible to people with disabilities. And when I'm talking about disability or accessibility, I'm going beyond just the typical definition of disability, because if you take somebody like myself who's in his 50s, my eyesight is not what it was when I was younger. My hearing is not what it was when I was younger. I don't identify as having a disability, but at the same time, my abilities aren't the same as what they were before. And so accessibility goes beyond just someone that is in the category of a disability that has a major impact in their day-to-day life, which is how some of the big organizations define a disability. So essentially, accessibility is super important for a very wide variety of people because over 1/3 of the population is over 50. So I'd say that's a couple of shifts. And then the final one that's really important is internal apps. So you might have had an internal app, meaning that you have something inside the company, whether it's from an HR app to just something that you use on a day-to-day basis. Those internal apps, they aren't always accessible. In fact, most of them are not. And what's happened is you might be coming into the workforce, and when you're physically there, you might have an HR person or somebody that makes sure to have these internal apps work for people in person, and it's totally different when you're remote and you have to interact with these internal apps. And I've seen a lot of growth from corporations demanding that the apps that they are the customers of become accessible. And I think that this is where there's going to be a really big shift, because the vendors that are creating that software are going to have to improve their accessibility.
Thank you, Joe. And has remote and flexible work influenced accessibility positively?
So for the reasons I said above, just because all of a sudden it was everybody at once had to move to virtual and a lot of these apps, it became obvious instantly where there were gaps in the accessibility. So a lot of the software has improved considerably. So in that respect, it's been good. And then when you think about the video conferencing, for the people for whom the accessibility of video conferencing works, it's really, really good. However, there's a wide variety of experiences, and for a lot of people, it got a lot worse. Some people need to have that in-person touch and are missing that considerably, because that in-person touch can help in so many ways. But again, it's all a balance, because some people do better at home, where for sure in the home there tends to be more optimization for the individual. And so if they're sitting there at home and they have all of these things that they've set up in order to work better at home. When I say work, I mean just day-to-day life. This can be a massive improvement. So I think it's just one of those things that you can't say it's better or worse. It's better for some, worse for others.
And Joe, since you began working in the accessibility industry, how have you seen it grow?
Awareness has grown considerably. I don't want to take credit for it, but I do think that Global Accessibility Awareness Day every single year grows and grows. There's lots more people talking about it, so I can only speak to what I'm exposed to on a yearly basis, if not on a daily basis. So I'd say people hadn't heard about accessibility, and there's still plenty that don't know what that means, but lots of people, lots of developers, lots of people in tech, today you mention accessibility, they know what it means. And then I'll echo some of what Andy said. By the way, Andy's insights were fantastic. Thank you, Andy, for that. And particularly, you mentioned a couple of different organizations that are getting the C-suite to make commitments to accessibility. And it's so important in terms of the workplace, pointing out that there's an entire workforce that is very productive, but you just need to pay attention to them and make sure that you're making things accessible to them. So the C-suite commitment, I've never seen that. It took years and years, and I'd say just in the last year or two, that's grown tremendously. And then another interesting thing is primetime commercials. You're seeing companies that started with the FANG, the top tech stocks would do primetime commercials for accessibility, but now I've seen it in the Fortune 500 as well. And it's kind of surreal. And it's one of those things where a lot of people in the disability community are unhappy when it's done incorrectly, or when people share what's called inspiration porn, where you're just taking somebody that has a disability, is getting on with their life, and then you tell them how inspiring they are. That's just, I don't know what the word is, but it just doesn't come off very well. So there's some commercials that are just fantastic, and then there's others which you see it the first time, okay, but then it's over and over and over, and you start to feel like they're trying to exploit their people with disabilities, and they did a little thing and they're like, hey, look at me. So there's certainly a balance there, but the fact that we're seeing commercials is a really great thing, because it means people are starting to realize the importance of it.
Thank you, Joe. Right now, why is it a unique time for accessibility?
I think there's lots of factors, but I'd say one of the big ones is the DEI movement has grown tremendously. And this is a very simple answer. How can you have diversity and inclusion and exclude people with disabilities? So this is something that I'd say, in my experience with DEI groups, they will often say that they care about it, but often not really pay attention to people with disabilities. But that's starting to become old, and it's finally reaching the point where we really actually have to not just talk about it, we have to do something about it. And I'd say that's why we're starting to pay attention. And I think it's going to just grow in the next few years.
And Joe, as I asked Andy, could you share 3 of your favorite accessibility resources that folks can use to help their customers or clients find employment?
Yes. Well, I'll just share accessibility resources in general. WebAIM.org is one of these organizations. We actually partnered with them to do some research around accessibility. So that's WEBAIM.org, and they do a yearly report where they look at the top 1 million websites for accessibility. And we do something similar where we're looking at manual testing. They do an automated test because they have a tool that that does test for accessibility and tries to find whatever is possible through the through automated means. Another is the W3C tutorial. You have to Google that, but basically if you Google W3C accessibility tutorial, you will find it. And then DQ University is something that I took and where I personally learned about accessibility. And DQ is spelled DEQUE University, and it's really just one word.org. And those are really helpful because it'll help, at least if you want to break into the accessibility field, all of those will help you understand accessibility. And there is a tremendous need for folks that have accessibility experience. So I think that would be a great one if you're technically minded.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joe. And now I would like to move on to Joe Rowan. So Joe, I would just like to thank you again for being here today. And Joe, I'd like you to describe your employment journey as a person with vision impairment or low vision.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I would just define my employment journey as really a tale of two lifetimes. In my 20s and 30s, I worked at what's called the Business Enterprise Program. In this country, at the state level, you can go into any government building, you will find kiosks of all kinds, whether they be coffee shops or newsstands, gift shops. Those are more often than not operated by blind and visually impaired people. There's a state rehab program in every state where they try to employ blind people that are capable of running their own business. They set you up with a location which is enough square footage to run a business. They offer you enough money to get you started on the stock you necessarily need, candy bars, soda cans, things like that, whatever you might need for supplies, and they provide the major equipment. They give you training, and for 22 years I did that in the state of Massachusetts. The wonderful thing about it is that it gives you a large degree of autonomy. What that really means to me as a blind person is that I don't necessarily do things the way a sighted person does them. So I had the freedom to mold my own environment. And indeed, if I needed some sighted help, I was free to hire them, which I did. I thought one of the greatest gifts running my own business for 22 years gave me was the ability to solve problems. I think that's often overlooked with disabled people, quote unquote disabled, is that they can't do everything the way the average Joe on the street does them, so they become fantastic problem solvers. Even in their day-to-day life, they don't do everything the way you would, but certainly some things they have to find new ways. I learned all those tricks of the trade running my own business. It was a wonderful opportunity. The second half of my life, in my 40s and 50s, I made a total left turn, mostly due to moving. My wife got an opportunity to move to a new job, which she was excited about, and I was excited to move on to a different career. I tried to make a career change to the tech world. That didn't go nearly as smoothly. I got an education. I earned certificates in database administration and web development. I also did self-study on malware removal, got quite a bit of a tech education. I had already taken several college courses in computer programming and so forth. When it came to putting resumes out on the street, trying to get an interview, somehow it just didn't go quite right. There is a conundrum often discussed amongst blind and visually impaired, and I'm sure all disabled people, I'm just talking about my circle of friends. How do we do this? Do we mention that we're visually impaired or do we not? And I don't think there's a right answer. If I don't answer it, I'm going to walk into someone's interview holding my white cane and I'm going to shock them. I think that's just human nature. They don't expect it. You hit them with the unexpected, or somehow in advance you tell them that you're blind and they get scared. I don't necessarily think the ADA has been all good. It's hard to say the ADA is a bad thing, but I do believe there are some people who, if they get a sniff of a disabled person, they get nervous. because they think lawsuit. That's what they do think. I don't think it's been always rocky road. I think, in fact, it's been getting better over the years. But those are some of the things I faced trying to find a job. In the 20 years since I moved and got out of that business enterprise program, I probably tried a half a dozen different internships, volunteer opportunities, and different education programs. Just poking around, trying several things with local government, local Lighthouse, which is an NGO, non-governmental organization, and the local community college. All gave me opportunities to internship, but they never did materialize into a job. I think I had nearly given up. I'm in my 60s when I came across a job ad for Geographic Solutions, and they took a huge leap of faith. I had showed them that I had a good technical background. In fact, I got much of it at the Q University that Joe was mentioning. It's a fantastic learning resource. Also, I'm a native user of screen readers. I've been using them every day for the last 30 years. I think that's one of the most important things that GSI saw as a value in hiring me. The leap of faith has worked out. I've been here 3 years now with the company, and I think it's been a great partnership. It not only is it good for Geographic Solutions, but as a person who has struggled to find employment for 20 years, now it seems poetic that at least the major role in my job, making our products more accessible, is really making it easy for other people who are disabled looking for a job, because that's what our products do, workforce and unemployment. It makes those people's job to find work easier. So I find that to be pretty karmically correct. I think I've found my niche.
Thank you, Joe. I really appreciate you sharing that. And if you wouldn't mind, just describe a few things about your position as a QA accessibility tester, and especially somebody who is, testing accessibility with low vision, or as you put it, for a person who is blind.
Sure.
And by the way, that's not a misspelling. I thought I would be funny on the slide, and so hopefully it worked out. If not, we'll just move on.
No worries. In my position, not only do I need to consider people who are visually impaired and blind, I need to consider people with all disabilities. That's where getting a certificate from the International Association of Accessibility Professionals came in very handy, and also going back to the Q University, their education program was really very helpful to understand people with motor difficulties, people with cognitive difficulties, people with seizure disorders, people even with arthritis. Very simple things, and as Andy said, many things are invisible. So learning how to make a web product accessible to all those categories of people, not just blind and disabled, it's been a really growth experience for me. Luckily, using a screen reader is not just helpful to blind people, but it is helpful to people with all those disabilities. Many people use a screen reader not because it talks, it verbalizes what's on the screen, but it also allows them to use a keyboard in a very effective way. They may not be able to use a mouse. I don't just press the arrow keys and the tab key. There's a whole collection of hotkeys that a screen reader can use that allows a person to navigate all around the screen. And although I use my screen reader so it'll verbalize the information, the voice can be turned off and you still retain the amazing navigation that these software products, screen readers, afford you. Understanding what other people go through is a hard thing. We've had empathy workshops at GSI where people come in and they understand how someone with a seizure disorder or a motor disorder or hearing disorder all can interact with our products because we work very hard. And so they understand what a person might go through.
Thank you, Joe. Joe, as we discussed with both Andy and Joe D, I'd like you to name a couple of your favorite tools or resources that can help persons with vision impairment or low vision to navigate websites.
Sure. I really don't think there's a lot more that can be said besides a screen reader is the go-to tool for me and for many for the reasons I already mentioned. As far as resources about those screen readers, the manufacturers, one is called NVDA, that stands for Non-Visual Desktop Access. They have a free screen reader, and it's very effective. It works for a lot of people. It is preferable to people who just cannot get state funding or simply can't afford to buy the screen reader I use, which is called JAWS, Job Access with Speech. It's much more robust. It does a lot more than NVDA, but for the average user, NVDA will certainly get you around the web, your email, and most of Microsoft products. If you get into highly specialized and proprietary products, JAWS is going to be the screen reader you need. Those two screen reader websites, you would have to Google either JAWS or NVDA. That's the easiest way to find the websites, but those two websites are full of education resources and also ways to purchase or just download the free version. And I can only echo what Joe said, which was about WebAIM, the Q University, and the W3C. Those are regular resources for me. I regularly access them all the time. Those are more for the technical-minded person, whether you be a developer or a designer. I don't think the average consumer would go to these places too much, but if you have any interest as a disabled person in getting an education, you cannot do better than the Q University.
Thank you, Joe. And can you share a few takeaways or experiences from working at home?
Sure. I was actually working at home before the pandemic. It was mostly a function of transportation. That is a big thing. If you're not living in a city community, if you're out in even the suburbs or certainly in rural, transportation is the biggest issue you have trying to get to the office. I will say that it was nice in the office because if I did have a problem with my computer, it locked up for some reason. It's not unusual to just have your computer freeze up and I lose speech. It was easy to walk across the office and say, "Can you come over and help?" And they were usually would find something they could just click on, some window they could click on and close it and solve my problems. Whereas if I run into that problem here at home, often my only recourse is to reboot the PC. And sometimes it happens right in the middle of doing something very important. I also have discovered a new resource since I've been working at home. I'm going to give you two resources where I can use my mobile phone to call up a service, and utilizing the phone's camera, I can point it at the computer screen and they can help me see where I don't have an office mate nearby, but I still have a camera on my phone, and they become my virtual helper. The first one is called Be My Eyes. It's a free service manned by volunteers. The only bad part about that is you cannot guarantee you're going to get somebody. The other service I use is called AIRA, A-I-R-A, and you get connected immediately to a trained agent, and they usually they do an excellent job. I can just say their training has been excellent. And even though I'm asking for something real simple, like what do you see on my screen, they're trained to do a lot of things. Many of the people I know who use AIRA use it in their travels, and it's extremely helpful. If you can just need a little helping hand here and there in your travels, it's an amazing resource. The other thing I wanted to mention was Andy brought up two interesting points about the workplace and disabled people. He brought up the that someone in the office is going to be in a more social environment, and I think people get to know you on a different level than they do at a Zoom meeting. I know in my own personal life and in my professional life, when I did spend time in the office, people after a while would sort of forget I was blind. Not really, but they understand who I am as a person and that I have capabilities, and somehow it becomes not the blind guy at work, it's just Joe. And that's how my family and friends have always thought about me, and I consider that to be quite a win. And I really consider that a compliment. The other thing that Andy mentioned, which I have been thinking about a lot lately, is the idea of people in the office who have disabilities that aren't necessarily visible. I have no choice. I don't I'm walking with the white cane. I think you know who that is and why I have the white cane. I have talked to several people at my company who have disabilities that nobody knows about, and they're not likely to divulge that. Not because they're ashamed or anything like that. It's mostly because they can do their job just fine, and I don't think they want to have possible stereotypes or stigmas attached to them. I do think what Andy said, having the courage to bring up his bipolar, it really opens up people a lot of ways, because I've had people mention their disabilities to me. I don't think they'd do it to a person without a disability. So I think somehow I have had at least toying around in my mind the idea of forming an employee resource group of disabled people. And if anybody in our company is interested in that, I'd appreciate feedback, because I certainly couldn't do something like this on my own. But that'd be one of the ways you can improve the work environment, is to share resources and support each other, and together creatively find ways that the company can better attract disabled people.
Thank you, Joe. And I love the part about kind of touching on, bringing your authentic self to work. I think there's a lot that I've read about that, and so I appreciate that. And one more thing before we move into a group discussion where we will address questions from the audience. In your opinion, and based on your experiences, more importantly, how can we make the workforce even more accessible for remote and work from home employees?
I think education is the most important thing. And I mean education from the executive level people to the software vendors, to the developers and themselves, to the schools who teach the developers. It is such a black box. That is, accessibility in general is such a black box, or it has been. It's changing, just as Joe and Andy have said. I wish there were technical schools that would know the word accessibility. Somehow I hear these people, or find these people that come out of technical schools and they say they're a developer or they're a designer, and somehow accessibility wasn't touched on that much. I also think the third-party vendors are getting more pressure now to make their products accessible. In Geographic Solutions, not everything I use is accessible. I would say the company has been amazing, giving me any leeway or accommodation necessary to allow me to do my job. Luckily, the core operations of my job are mostly accessible, but there are a few things that simply are not. I don't think that'll last forever. I think that's changing faster and faster. Thirdly, I would say that one of the earth-moving things that could happen would be a Supreme Court decision on exactly what accessibility is, isn't, penalties, all that. Now, the Justice Department has taken a giant step towards that this past spring by giving the ADA some definition. There was a little language in the ADA that talked about accommodations, and it was argued in some legal arenas that that didn't apply for the web. The reason is, well, the ADA was created before the web existed, so it was a reasonable argument. But the Justice Department has clarified language on that just this spring. I think that'll make a huge difference. But someday, I do think it will take a Supreme Court landmark kind of suit to really make people sit up and take notice.
Thank you, Joe. At this point, I'd like to invite all of the speakers back onto the screen, and let's go ahead and discuss some of the questions that are coming in from the audience. And by all means, folks, please continue to put your questions into the Q&A window. And one question that I have from the audience is, our American Job Centers are looking at integrating more devices such as iPads for accessibility. Are there apps that you suggest, or are there suggested apps?
I'll take that for a minute. I will tell you that the app world in at least iOS, I'm not an Android user, but I do use iOS. It's just struggling at least as much as websites. The bad part about that is that Apple has taken great pains to incorporate accessibility tools right into their developer tools. You don't have to look far for them. I just hope that I can give you one good website off the top of my head, a website called Apple Vis, VIS. If you're iOS user and you have a disability, Apple Vis will give you some amazing apps, because as we all know, there's 10 apps for this. Even just take a GPS app for instance. I've probably played with 17 different GPS apps, because not necessarily the native ones are the best, but Apple Vis would be a good resource for that. And I just hope that the app world catches up with accessibility soon too, because there's plenty of work to do.
I'm going to add something because you just jogged my memory, Joe R. That 1 year on GAD, Apple actually released a category for accessible apps, and I'm pretty sure that they've retained that. So if you search for categories, I believe you will find in the Apple App Store just an entire category. It will only tell you apps that are made for accessibility. So hopefully that will give you help. Evan, do you mind if I just also address something that Joe R said earlier? So Joe, you were talking about a Supreme Court ruling, and I'd say even before there, because the Supreme Court will rule over legislative matters which are kind of in disagreement, but where I think we need to go is to get some bipartisan legislation that codifies, that codifies specifically that the Americans with Disabilities Act refers to digital accessibility, which to some degree the Department of Justice has done. But I think this really needs to be some really strong legislation, very well thought out and bipartisan, because this is an issue that affects both parties. There's no reason, there is certainly a fight, but there's no reason for there to be a battle between the parties. But I'd also love to know what Andy thinks about that. And sorry to hijack the questions there, Evan.
That's by all means, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Joe Devin and Joe Rowan. Thanks for bringing up kind of the need for clarity in terms of federal law. I agree with Joe Devin that if we could get bipartisan legislation passed, that's a more straightforward path to kind of clarifying what is required by the Americans with Disabilities Act and other federal civil rights laws. One of the challenges with the Supreme Court case is we have no control about where the court will land on that issue. And if you look at the Supreme Court's history in disability rights, it has not been great. We had a number of decisions that narrowed the scope of who was protected by the ADA to the point where we had to go back to Congress and pass the ADA Amendments Act in 2008, which overturned 4 Supreme Court decisions to clarify that lots of people who are functioning very well but still experiencing discrimination are protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act. So Joe Rowan, I guess I would say be careful what you wish for. You're right to want clarity, and you're right to expect the United States Supreme Court to take a strong stand for accessibility and inclusion. But if you look at the court's track record, it's not a great track record on our issues.
Wouldn't argue with that for a second, but it could be the impetus that forces Congress to take a meaningful step.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you. Great discussion. Another question from the audience: are there evaluation tools that organizations can use to evaluate where they are in their accessibility journey? Something that highlights checkpoints that organizations should consider for existing and new staff?
So WCAG, which these days WCAG 2.1, stands for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And if you Google that, you're going to find them. I wouldn't say they're in plain English. You have to be pretty technical. And even if you're technical and you're not technical regarding accessibility, you're going to be challenged with it, which is kind of common with standards. But that's really the place where you're going to see all of these checkpoints. But there's also tools that will get you some automated tests of where you stand. WebAIM does have the WAVE tool. Also for checklists, DQ University has a ton of checklists in every single angle of accessibility. And then IBM and Microsoft, they both have an accessibility checker. And there's a lot of apps that have accessibility checks. You just have to look for it, like typically under tools. For example, Microsoft PowerPoint has a really good one. Yeah, I'd say that's my answer.
Thank you, Joe. Jody. And I would like to also ask another question from the audience. What can be done to improve inclusion and accessibility for the neurodivergent populations?
I have an answer, but I want to let others speak too. So if anybody else has an answer, go for it. If not, I'll take it.
Joe, why don't you go first, and I'm happy to chime in after.
Sure. So you're seeing some folks like we kind of specialize in streaming, so I pay more attention to video players, streaming, that kind of thing. So I pay more attention to that. So if you look at Netflix, you'll see that at the beginning of a movie, you're going to see warnings on strobe lights. So that's something that more streamers can copy. Then you've got customization of apps is one way to do it, because I, for example, don't like a dark background and a light foreground. I like the light background, dark foreground. That's just the way my eyes work. I have lots of issues with visual issues, but there's other people that have the exact opposite, and they need to have that dark background and light foreground. And being able to customize that on all your digital experiences would be something that I think would help a lot. Then there's spell checkers. If you have issues with spelling, or if you're I forgot the word now. If you have dyslexia, that's one where the spell checker could be really helpful. Closed captions are really useful for lots of different populations. You know, we're thinking of it in terms of if you're deaf, a lot of people are hard of hearing, that it helps, but it actually helps people that are neurodivergent, as well as folks who have a different language as their first language. It really helps to identify names and things like that. And audio description, which is essentially, if you're blind, it does a description of the scene so that you can understand what's going around on the scene beyond just the audio. So I'd say that all of those are also helpful for people who are neurodivergent.
Yeah, this is Andy. All I would add is I think sometimes when we think about accessibility, we prioritize aspects of accessibility that are relatively easy to measure and to like have a right or wrong answer to. So is it screen reader accessible is something that you can measure? Do you have, you know, good quality captions is something you can measure? Do you have sign language interpreters, something you can measure? For some people with different forms of neurodiversity, and I have bipolar disorder, which is part of neurodiversity, it's not as easy to measure whether a website is intuitive or clean or elegant or simple. But for me, that's what I look for when I interact with technology. I'm kind of a technology phobe. So I had a chance to ask one of Microsoft's leaders on accessibility recently, why is Zoom so much more intuitive than Teams when I get on a webinar? And he hated the question. You know, he tried to defend Teams and tell me how Teams had all this great functionality in it that Zoom doesn't have. But I think he missed the point that I don't want all of that functionality, and that there are users like me that just want simplicity, and that is a form of accessibility. So I think sometimes we privilege some forms of accessibility over others, and it's good to have this broader conversation about how to make it work well for as many people as possible.
Evan, I'd like to chime in and kind of take a little bit what Andy said and what Joe said and combine it into another answer.
Sure.
Checking for accessibility for all different categories of people is not an easy thing to do. And I don't want anybody to think it can be done with an automated tool. You can get some idea, but certainly not the things that Andy just talked about. They cannot be detected by any automated tool. And I think there's some people out there trying to serve up these automatic, you see a button at the top of the website, make this accessibility friendly. And I think they're really doing the community a disservice, because it's just not that easy. I think you need trained people, and you need people who walk in the shoes, not just blind people or visually impaired, but people who walk in Andy's shoes, people who walk in cognitively impaired shoes. And those are the kind of people who really can test and tell you if your website's doing what you intended to do.
100% on the money, and those automated tools are typically get you to 30%. Some people are working on AI and machine learning that maybe will get it to 50%, but 50 to 70% is not detectable automatically. Yeah, you're right on the money.
Thank you, Andy, Joe Devin, Joe Rowan. Thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your experience and your guidance. We are right at 12 p.m. and I want to be respectful of folks' times today. Here is some contact information for Andy, for Joe, and for Joe D, and for Joe R. Here is our contact information for Geographic Solutions. And I would just like to follow up and let you know that we have a workforce technology conference that we throw every year. Here's some information about that for 2022. It happens in October. You can check out our website at geographicsolutions.com for more information. And last but not least, again, thank you so much to Andy, Joe, and Joe for joining us today. I am grateful for your time. And so I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you to the audience for attending and have a great day. Be excellent to each other.